This is the first talk in a four-part series on why I am a Christian. We're going to talk today about making sense of existence. So Mark Twain famously tells a story about a small boy who came home from church. Dad asked him, "What'd you learn today?" He says, "We learned about faith." And his dad said, "So what's faith?" And the little boy said, "Faith is believing in something you know is not true." And I ask you, isn't that what a lot of people think? A lot of people think that belief in God is nothing more than wishful thinking. I once asked a young man if he believed in God, and he said, "Oh no," he says, "I believe in science." I asked him to explain that to me, and he said, "Well, science is all about facts, and God is all about faith." And I thought, what an interesting separation of those two things. And I don't think that science or faith need to necessarily be separated. They are different domains with different kinds of evidence, but they are not in contradiction, as we'll see. Many people think that faith is unreasonable. Many people suspect that to become a Christian, you need to kiss your brains goodbye. And for the next few weeks, I want to challenge that assumption. I hope to demonstrate that there are some compelling reasons for faith and that you can and should be a Christian with intellectual integrity. I'll tell you why I'm a Christian. So first I want to pose a question to you. If someone were to ask you, "Why are you a Christian?" what would you tell them? What kind of compelling reasons do you have for believing what you believe? 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." Always be prepared to give an answer. So this practice of giving answers or explaining the reasons behind your faith is called apologetics. Now, don't misunderstand that word. It's not that we are apologetic for believing. It's not like someone asks you, "Why are you a Christian?" You go, "I know, I'm so sorry, it's so stupid. What can I say? I apologize." That's not what apologetics means. The word apologetics comes from a Greek legal term, apologia, which means to give a defense, as in to give a defense in court. And the word comes from two Greek words, apo, which means from, and logia, which means reason, from reason. Be prepared, Peter says, to give an answer. And that word answer is that Greek word apologia. Be prepared to give a defense of what you believe, the reasons for your faith. So in these four talks, I'm going to be dealing with apologetics, the reasons we believe. And honestly, I'm going to be skimming the surface of a very deep subject. Thousands and thousands of books have been written on this. And if you want to dig a little deeper, I've created a bibliography of recommended resources that's available online on our website or on our app. In fact, if you pull up the app, it'll be on the front page of the app. Why am I a Christian? Well, let me just start by briefly telling you a little bit about my story, and you'll see why that's important part of this whole deal. So I was 13 years old, and I considered myself to be an atheist. And you might be wondering, why were you an atheist at 13? Well, this was my reasoning. It was very simple. I wanted to do what I wanted. And I thought that if there's a God, there must also be right and wrong. And so if there's right and wrong, if there's a God and there's right and wrong, that cramped my style. So the easiest way to be able to do what I want was simply to get rid of God. Hence, I became an atheist. It wasn't very sophisticated thinking, but as we'll see, it was not far off the mark either. So one day, a junior high friend of mine knocks on my door and invites me to a youth rally at his church. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to disappoint my friend. So I went that night, Saturday night, to this youth rally, and I got ambushed by Jesus. The speaker that night was a young college student, Sam Owen. You remember meeting him a couple months ago? And Sam talked about Jesus in a very real, personal and compelling way. And that night when it was done, I walked home, and on my way home, I prayed my first prayer ever, and I said, "God, I don't know much about you. All I know is what that guy has, I want. So here's my life." Well, I got up the next morning, Sunday morning, and I thought, now what do I do? Well, the only thing I knew for sure about Christians is what do? Look at you. Yeah. They go to church on Sunday, right? So I got up that Sunday morning, walked down to that little church, and the rest is history. God heard my prayer on that Saturday night, and my life began changing radically. So when I pose the question, why am I a Christian? You might hear my story and say, well, you're a Christian because you were moved by hearing a speaker when you were young and impressionable. But if you have been older and more sophisticated in your thinking, you might have heard the same message and not become a Christian. Well, that's possibly true. But then I would add, why then, when I got older and much more sophisticated, check out these socks. Speaking of sophistication, look at those. I'm sporting the GU socks today. I'm representing. What can I say? But so when I got older, and as you can see, much more sophisticated, why then, when I was older, why then did I not only keep my faith, but found it even more convincing, more valuable, and more true? Well, here's why. Because when I was in college, I began facing the questions about my faith, and to my delight, I discovered that the Christian faith could withstand the scrutiny. I've continued to wrestle with these questions over the years, as have millions of Christians before me, many of them much, much smarter than me, and become convinced that there are good reasons, compelling reasons to believe in Jesus. And over the next 4 weeks, I want to look at some of those with you. So the first one, here's the first one, big idea, top of your outline. I am a Christian because it makes sense of the universe and our place within it, our lives within it. When I was in college, I took a couple psychology courses from Dr. Lawrence Bixler. Dr. Bix, as we called him, was a really smart guy. He was one of the most popular professors on our college campus, our small Christian college. But he also taught psychology classes across the street at the University of Oregon, where he was also a very popular professor. He told us that the students at the U of O often asked him about his Christian faith. And here's what he told them. He said that he found the Christian faith intellectually satisfying because it gave the best answers to life's biggest questions. The best answers to life's biggest questions. Tim Keller, in his excellent book, The Reason for God, agrees with Dr. Bixler. He wrote, Christians don't claim that their faith gives them omniscience or absolute knowledge of reality. Only God has that. But Christians believe that the Christian account of things, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, the Christian account of things makes the most sense of the world. I've often said that your heart cannot rejoice in what your head cannot accept. If something seems unbelievable or unreasonable, it's pretty hard to get excited about it. And I want your heart to rejoice, so I need to engage your head for the next 30 minutes. Are you ready for that? When I was in grade school, my teacher used to say, students, screw on your thinking caps. That's what I need you to do for the next 30 minutes. All right, so here we go. I'm going to focus on two questions, the cosmological question and the moral question. Number one, the cosmological question. What caused everything that exists? Imagine walking through the woods on a path, and you come across a large glass ball. What do you think? You don't think about that? Large glass ball in the middle of the woods. What do you think? How did it get there? Yeah. What is this thing doing in the middle? How did this thing get here? Why is this here? Mankind has been asking these sorts of questions about the universe from the beginning. Why is it here? What caused it? Where did it come from? This is the cosmological question. Now, don't let the word cosmological scare you. Cosmology comes from two Greek words, cosmos, which means world, and logos, which means reason. Cosmology is the reason for the world. It's simply people trying to make sense out of the universe that we live in. And philosophers, theologians, and scientists have been doing this for centuries, wrestling with the cosmological questions. And millions of words have been written trying to answer this question. And frankly, some of it is some really heady stuff. But in the end, when you boil all those millions of words down, you end up with really only two possible answers or two categories of answers to the cosmological question. What caused everything that exists? Well, the universe either has a personal or an impersonal cause. Either there's a God who created the universe, or the universe itself is self-existent and self-caused. Something came first. Either God came first or matter came first. Those are the two basic options. For our purposes today, I'm going to call these two options theism and naturalism. All right, and we'll put a slide up on the screen here. Theism, on the one hand, as a personal beginning. You start with a person rather than matter. Naturalism, on the other hand, is impersonal. It just starts with matter. There is no person behind the universe. Theism starts with God. Naturalism starts with matter. Theism postulates an eternal God, that God has always been. Naturalism postulates that matter or the universe has always been. Now, here's the question. Can I prove either one of these? No, I cannot prove them. I was not there at the beginning. Were you? No. What we can do is look at the evidence and, draw some conclusions from the evidence. But each of these starting points ultimately is assumed. Said another way, it's a point of faith. I can't prove there's a God. I can't prove that there's not a God and that only matter is all there is. In fact, let's take a moment and just consider the nature of proof here for a moment. Has anyone ever asked you, prove to me that there's a God? How many of you have ever had that someone say? Okay, quite a few of you. Prove to me that there's a God. Well, you can't. You can't absolutely prove that there's a God or that there's not. But here's the interesting thing. We don't live our lives, for the most part, based on absolute proof, but on degrees of probability. In court, a decision isn't reached in court because of absolute proof, but we ask a jury to make a decision based upon proof beyond what? A reasonable doubt. Every one of us in the room every day makes multiple decisions based upon degrees of probability rather than absolute proof. Let me show you what I mean, and we'll just use a real simple example here. Can you absolutely prove who you are? Okay, how would you do that? How would you prove to me who you are? Okay, a birth certificate. Can a birth certificate be forged? Absolutely. Someone else said a driver's license. Can a driver's license be forged? How about your passport? So let's just establish that any document that you could create, it's possible that that document was forged, right? What's that? Okay, your parents. So you could bring people to me who know you and say, these people will vouch for me. Is that an absolute proof? Is it possible that those people are either mistaken or deceived by you, that you fooled them? Now, some of you are going, I'm a mother. I brought this person into the world. That's your testimony. How do I know that it's true? Here's the thing. DNA, huh? Well, DNA could connect you to someone, but would it prove that you are who you say you are? So here's the thing. My point's really simple. We do this every day. You come up and introduce yourself to me. You say your name. You introduce me to your family. If I'm at the store and you're trying to cash a check, I ask for your driver's license. If I see those things, I believe you are who you say you are. Not because it's absolute proof, but because it's reasonable to believe that. Isn't that right? Now, do people sometimes get fooled? Of course. But it's reasonable to believe. Now, the point I'm making here is that all of us believe things like this every day that are not based upon absolute truth, but based upon reasonable probability. It's the normal way that we all process information and make decisions. I simply point that out to say that it's unreasonable for someone to ask for absolute proof that when it comes to God. Tim Keller suggests we should approach it this way. He says we should approach it with what he describes as critical rationality. And by that he means look at the clues. And then he adds that the clues provide clues, evidence, but he says every clue is also rationally avoidable. So think, for example, of the driver's license, right? That the driver's license is a good clue, but could it be fake? The answer is yes. There's always another way to explain things, and that's what Keller is saying. But he says when you add up enough of those clues, the driver's license, the birth certificate, the passport, the mother, the DNA, the fingerprint, so on, right? When you add enough of those clues together, it becomes reasonably probable to make a good decision. So, what are some of the clues? What are some of these clues of God that have been left through the universe that could help us answer the cosmological question. All right, so I'm going to just give you a couple real quick, and there are many. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who's one of the leading philosophers in the world today, has postulated that there are about 24 of these cosmological clues for God, different proofs for God. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the clue that the evidence that the universe had a beginning. The evidence that the universe had a beginning. For many years, people thought that the universe, and this is on the naturalist side, the naturalists would have said that the universe was eternal, that matter has always been. But most scientists agree now with theists that the universe actually had a very specific beginning. The universe, for example, is expanding. All of the galaxies are moving away from each other at tremendous speeds, and by tracing these movements backwards, scientists believe that at some point in time, a tremendous explosion occurred that ejected all matter outward from a central point of high-density compression. This particular theory is called what? The Big Bang, right. The Big Bang, they say, was the birth of the universe. Now, what's fascinating about that is, again, that until that was discovered in 1929, Edwin Hubble and the Hubble telescope, until that was discovered, everyone thought that the universe was just eternal, that it had always been. But all of a sudden they're going, wait a minute, the universe had a beginning. Scientists also tell us that the universe is aging. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, says that the amount of usable energy in the universe is decreasing. In other words, the universe is running down, which suggests that it had a starting point when it was wound up with maximum energy. So here we've got this interesting thing. We've got theists who may disagree with modern science on the originating cause, but agree with modern science that the universe itself is not eternal, that the universe actually had a beginning, a birthday, if you will. And this, as I was reading on this in the last couple of weeks, what was interesting was the consternation that this caused back from 1929 when it was first postulated. For about the next 40 or 50 years, scientists really wrestled with this data. It was shocking to them that the universe wasn't eternal, that the universe had a beginning. Dr. Robert Jastrow, a well-known astronomer, wrote this. He said, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself up over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." The first words of the Bible are, in the beginning, God. Yeah, not in the beginning, matter, or in the beginning, the universe, but in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible starts with God, with that personal beginning, and says everything began there. The universe had a beginning. This doesn't prove God, but it's a clue. Second, the anthropic principle. I'm giving you another cosmological clue here. The anthropic principle. The word anthropic comes from the Greek word anthropos, man, so it just means the man-centered principle or the fine-tuning of the universe. When we study the universe, we see that it seems to be set up to support life like ours. And what's really shocking about this is how many variables seem to be fine-tuned so that if even one of them were off by just a hair, there would be no life. Respected geneticist Dr. Francis Collins, once an atheist, now a Christian, leader of the Human Genome Project and author of The Language of God, said this: "When you look from the perspective of a scientist at the universe, it looks as if the universe knew we were coming. There are 15 constants. For example, the gravitational constant, various constants about strong and weak nuclear forces. And these constants, every one of them, he says, have precise values. If any one of those constants was off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases by 1 part in a million, the universe could not actually have come to the point where we see it. Matter would not have been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, no stars, no planets, and no people. In sum, he says, our universe is wildly improbable." Renowned physicist Stephen Hawking wrote, "If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionths." Did you catch that? 1 part in 100,000 million millionths. That's not very much. Then he says the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size into a hot fireball. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. And then he finishes by saying, I think there are religious implications. Going even further, Hawking writes, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. The anthropic principle. By the way, just a little aside here, as I was reading on this, this principle, the fine-tuning of the universe, is widely recognized by both theists and naturalists, all right? Scientists on both sides of this divide see this. How do the naturalists explain it? Well, the most popular explanation right now, for example, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, he'd say, yes, the universe appears to be fine-tuned. Yes, it seems highly improbable, but there is an explanation, he says. There may be an infinite number of universes. Imagine, he says, soap bubbles, and every bubble is itself a universe, and there's an infinite number of these bubbles, of these universes. He calls this theory the multiverse theory. So instead of a universe, one universe, it's a multiverse, many universes, infinite number. And he would say, as long as you have an infinite number of universes, then there is always the possibility that in one of those universes, all of the dials could have lined up precisely to have life. And he says, we just happen to be the lucky people who landed in the one universe out of the infinite number of universes where that happened. And I ask you, which takes more faith? To believe in an unproved, infinite number of universes, or to believe that there's an infinite personal God behind all of this. The anthropic principle, the fine-tuning of the universe, makes it look like it was designed for life. Again, this doesn't prove God, but it's a clue. I'm a Christian because God is the best explanation for the universe we live in. The universe, simply put, the universe makes more sense with a person behind it. Which leads to my second question. Number 2, the moral question. Everyone doing okay? Okay, still got the thinking caps on? Okay. Number 2, the moral question. How do we explain human morals and meaning? And this is where C.S. Lewis, in his famous book, Mere Christianity, begins. The first section in that book is entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. Lewis demonstrates that there is a universal sense of moral obligation. That is, human beings everywhere act like there is such a thing as an objective standard of right and wrong that exists outside of them. Even those who insist that there is no such thing as this standard still act as if there is. Lewis wrote this. He says, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in real right or wrong, you will find that same man going back on this just a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining, it's not fair, before you can say Jack Robinson. Lewis argues that morality is hardwired into us. So how do we explain this? Well, Lewis goes on to say what I just told you moments ago, that basically there are 2 answers to the cosmological question. How did the universe come to be? He calls these 2 answers the materialist, what we call naturalism, starts with matter, and he calls the other one the religious, starting with God, the theist. And he writes a very, very important thing. He says, please do not think that one of these views, the religious view, was held a long time ago, and that the other, the naturalist view, has gradually taken its place. This is what many people think today, right? That religion goes back eons and eons into our past, that it was superstition, it was us trying to explain the universe, and so we came up with the idea of God, but science has now replaced that and made all of that thinking outdated. And Lewis says, if you look at history, here's what he wrote. He says, wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. So go back as far into history as you want. When you read the writing of people that are thinking about this question, where the universe come from, you will always find some people who say there's a God, and that makes more sense, and other people who say there's nothing but matter. These 2 views have been around forever. Neither of them are new. So what I want to do is look at the moral question. Where did our morality come from both these perspectives? So here's the first question. If God is not there, if matter is all there is, what does that make you? Matter, right? That just makes you matter. Nothing more, nothing less. One time I was talking with a young man about this, and I'd ask him if he believed in God. No, and so I said, are you prepared to live with the consequences of your view that matter is all there is? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, let me pose a question to you. I said, I'm going to take a chainsaw, go into the woods, and cut down a dead tree and chop it up for firewood. Right or wrong? He says, nothing wrong with that. I said, okay, I'm going to take my chainsaw and come after you. Right or wrong? He says, you can't do that. I said, explain why. Because in the first one, where I take my chainsaw to a tree, it's matter acting upon matter. In the second one, when I take my chainsaw after you, it is matter acting upon matter. What's the difference? Well, for some reason, it seemed to matter. If matter is all there is, do you catch what I'm driving at here? If matter is all there is, then there is no real meaning, inherent meaning in the universe itself. Because matter by itself cannot create meaning or purpose. There also is no sense of this outward standard of morality. That's an illusion. But if, on the other hand, we are, as the Bible says, created by God in his image, then we have meaning, inherent meaning, and an objective basis for morality. The first problem that we have to address is, how do we explain the universal human desire for meaning and the universal presence of morality in human beings? It's everywhere. How do we explain that? I thought it was fascinating in Paco's story that he came to a place in his life where he thought, there's got to be something else, right? And isn't it interesting that he turned first to worship? That sense of transcendence, right? There's something or someone out there bigger than me that I need to get in touch with. And how do you do that? Well, that's called worship. And so I love what he did. And wasn't it interesting that in the middle of that worship experience where he has an encounter with God, what were the first words out of his mouth? Do you remember? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Fascinating. How do we explain the universal human longing for meaning, that there's transcendence? And how do we explain the universal sense of morality? I'm sorry. If the universe began impersonally, where did these things come from, and to what does it correspond? I'm thirsty for water, and water exists. I'm hungry for food, food exists. I desire meaning, but in an impersonal universe, there's nothing that corresponds to that. There is no inherent meaning. Where did that need come from? The presence of a personal, infinite God best explains human nature. The fact that we were created in his image. Now, some of you are a step ahead of me already. You're going, wait a minute, Joe. You're talking about morality being universal, but morality is not universal. If you go to different cultures, they have different sets of right and wrong, and that's true. But they still have a sense of right and wrong. That moral obligation. We may disagree about what the particulars are, but that moral obligation, that sense that there is some kind of a standard out there to which we should all adhere, is universal. And if you doubt that, let me point out two things. First of all, everybody has this sense of right and wrong. They may disagree about it, about what it is, but all of them have it. And how can you explain that? How can you explain that if the universe is fundamentally impersonal? Where did that come from? Friends, if all there is matter, and mix in time and chance to get to this point, well, first of all, that makes all of us cosmic accidents. But secondly, it means that whatever is. You can't say it's right or wrong because there is no personal force guiding that. There's no purpose, there's no meaning, and there's no right or wrong. Whatever is. There's no objective standard of rightness. So where did that come from? This universal moral sense. Secondly, this moral sense is seen clearly in how we all want to be treated. I think this is fascinating. That no matter what people say is right and wrong, when it comes to how they want to be treated, there are some universals that we all agree on. I'll show you what I mean. Some people may murder others, but no one wants to be murdered. Some people may lie to others, but no one wants to be lied to. Some people may steal from others, but no one wants to be stolen from. Some people may cheat others, but no one wants to be cheated. Am I right? And if you want to find out what those universal morals are, just look at the way people want to be treated, because it's even more clear than in the way we treat others. My point here is that you cannot adequately explain the presence in human beings of these moral desires and the desire for meaning by starting with an impersonal beginning. God's the best explanation for that. So the first problem is, how do we explain the presence of these things? But the second problem is, and this is, I think, kind of fascinating. The second problem is that it is impossible for someone to live consistently in the universe with the presuppositions of an impersonal universe. You may say that all there is matter. You may say that we're just cosmic accidents and that nothing matters, but nobody can live that way. And those who attempt to end up in utter despair. Interesting, Carl Sagan, famous scientist and well-known author, in his work Cosmos, he was the one in that work Cosmos who said the universe is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be. He actually used the Gloria Patri. He used religious language to describe the universe. Isn't that interesting? But then he goes on to say, because this is true, we, human beings, are cosmic accidents along with everything else in the universe. We're cosmic accidents. But here's what I find fascinating. Carl Sagan didn't live that way. He didn't live as though he were a cosmic accident. Several years ago, I read an article, this is before he passed away, I read an article that he and his wife wrote together on the abortion issue. And he tried to address whether it was right or wrong. And I read the article, having already read Cosmos and knowing that he thought we were cosmic accidents, and I couldn't help but think as I read the article, why do you care about this? Why do you care about this? If we are cosmic accidents destined to annihilation when the sun burns up, then why does it matter? There is a fundamental inconsistency with those who say there's no God, but want to live as though there is. I'll come back to that with another story here in just a moment. Without God, here's the reality. Without God, there is no inherent meaning in the universe and no hope of having any. Without God, there is no reason to live morally or to expect other people to live morally. If you believe that the universe is fundamentally impersonal, that matter is all there is, then I challenge you to live consistently with those beliefs. I don't think you can. And again, I'll tell a story about that in just a moment. So here comes the next issue then. Since naturalism provides no rational basis for morals, and they'll admit this, by the way. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Delusion of God, freely admits this and argues that you can be good without God. Well, on what basis? Well, he just says we have to make up our own morals. We have to construct our own meaning for life. It's all self-constructed. Well, this creates an interesting problem, because if we have to create our own morals, the next question is, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? So here we are. You know, there's over 1,000 of us in the room today. Let's just say we all come to the agreement, matter is all there is. There is no objective standard of right and wrong. We've got to make up our own right and wrong. How are we going to do that today? Who gets to decide? Well, I got the mic. That's one way. Actually, naturalists have proposed 6 different ways to construct morality. And you'll recognize them as we go through them. I'm going to put them up on the screen. Here's the first one. Pragmatism. Whatever works is right. Second one, individualism. This one's very popular today. You decide what's right for you. I hear people say this all the time. That's my truth, they say, as though truth were a subjective thing that they could decide upon themselves. Next 2. Multiculturalism. This is, again, very popular. All cultures are equally right. You just need to fit into the one you're in. Okay? But no culture can make a judgment about another culture. Hold that thought. Moral relativism. There are no absolutes, okay? There's no big right or wrong out there in the universe. It all depends just on the situation. Again, it goes back to individualism. You decide based on the situation. Here's the next one. This is very democratic, very American. Majority rules. As long as the majority thinks something is right, it's right, yeah. As long as 51% can say it's okay, it's okay. How'd that work for Nazi Germany? Slavery, another good example. Might is right. Whoever is in power, that's the one I just suggested, right? I got the mic, I decide. Okay? All of these answers have been proposed. The truth is, none of them has a rational basis. All of them are arbitrary attempts to impose moral order on what is a fundamentally amoral universe. And each of them are deeply problematic. I mentioned that individualism and moral relativism are very popular today, right? And basically, each person decides what's right for them in any given situation. And I bump into this all the time, don't you? People who say, you can't tell me what's right or wrong. I decide for myself. I love it when people say that. Because it's that is such a fundamentally inconsistent position. Here's why. I'm going to just give you a couple examples. I'm a child of the 60s. Ooh, peace, you know. Some of the rest of you are children of the 60s. You don't remember them because of what you were smoking at the time. But anyway, that's a whole other story. Right? But the 60s, start of free love. And this became, the whole moral relativism became very, very popular. We tossed off all the moral restraints. Here's what was fascinating about my peers in that time. I talked to so many people when I was on the University of Oregon College campus. I talked to so many people in that time who said, there is no truth, there is no right or wrong, we just each decide for ourselves. So they're saying there's no right or wrong, and they're turning around the next moment marching and saying the war in Vietnam is wrong. Excuse me? So what you're really saying is, no one can tell me that what I'm doing is right or wrong, but I reserve the right to make moral judgments about what you're doing anytime I want. Why is that? Because no one can live consistently with that morality. It's impossible. It's just plain impossible. If you believe that all truth is relative, that right and wrong is relative, then you can never again make a judgment about someone else's behavior, ever. You can never say abortion is right or abortion is wrong. You can never say racism is right or racism is wrong. You can never say polluting the environment is right or wrong. You can only say, I don't like it. But that's the most you can say, because everyone gets to construct their own truth, their own right or wrong. Do you see how inconsistent it is? Nobody lives this way. Mark Clark, I love this little story. Mark Clark, in his book, The Problem of God, tells about talking with a friend at work one day, and his friend told him, I believe that all morality is culturally constructed, relative, a product of evolution, and that it's wrong for our Western ideals to be projected onto other cultures. So he listed about 4 of those different 6 things we put up there, all right? And Mark writes, to test how committed he was to his belief, I asked him, I said, if we went into a village in the middle of a jungle somewhere, and we brought your little sister along, and they captured her and tied her up and tortured her and then ate her alive because that's what their culture believed in, how would you feel about that? What would your response be? If you're true to your worldview, you could not say they'd done anything wrong. You could only say they'd done something you didn't like, but nonetheless was morally acceptable in their culture. And Mark says, my friend thought for a moment, and then he looked at me and said, as much as it would hurt me to say it, I would not say they did something wrong, only something I personally disagreed with. Sucks to be his sister. Right? And here's what Mark finishes by saying, despite what my friend said that day, I knew he was lying to me. He was lying to me because moral relativists still care. We all care. We can't escape that. No one can live this way. Every human being on the planet believes certain things are right and other things are wrong, whether we like them or not. Tim Keller writes, people who laugh at the claim that there is a transcendent moral order do not think that racial genocide is just impractical or self-defeating. They think that it is wrong. They think it's wrong. Even though they say there's no right or wrong, they say that's wrong. The Nazis who exterminated the Jews may have claimed they didn't feel it was immoral at all. We don't care what they felt. We don't care if they sincerely felt like they were doing a service to humanity. They should not have done it because it was wrong. It was wrong, plain and simple. But naturalists have a very difficult time explaining why. If matter is all there is, then what is, period. And we have to make up our own morals, and here we back, full circle, back to square one. But if God is there, if there's a person behind the universe, that explains our universal sense of moral obligation and gives meaning to our lives. I'm a Christian because it best explains human nature and the universal desire for meaning and morality. So let me wrap up here with I'm going to show you a video and fun little application of this. Tomorrow, Monday, is a national holiday. It's Martin Luther King Day. And we are going to be honoring Dr. King for his work on racial justice, celebrating the gains that we have made, and promising to work together for the gains that have yet to be achieved. We've come a long ways. Would you all agree? We've come a long ways, but we still have a lot of work to do. Take a look at this video.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." Tonight, Steve Hartman is on the road with school kids who decided the time was right to right a wrong.
At the Mount Airy Resort in the Poconos of Pennsylvania, Reverend Gilbert Caldwell and his wife Grace are arriving for their second honeymoon.
We're here.
They were greeted warmly.
How are you?
A sharp contrast to their first visit 60 years earlier. In 1957, they were married in North Carolina, then drove 8 hours only to be turned back for being black.
How did they put it? Did they give you a reason?
First, they pretended I didn't have a reservation, where I actually brought a copy. And then, of course, they said, but if we said yes, our guests would be very unhappy.
They had to stay at a black-owned hunting lodge instead.
Men with these big guns.
Not what you were planning on for your honeymoon?
Not what we were planning on.
Prodded partly by that experience, Gil immersed himself in the civil rights movement, working side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. Today, he speaks about the movement, which is how he ended up at Bear Tavern Elementary in Titusville, New Jersey last year. He told the honeymoon story, as he'd done 100 times before. But for whatever reason, this group of fifth graders really took it to heart.
At the end of the story, I was like, that's just terrible.
It was really heartbreaking. Just because it's just so wrong. I feel like this is the worst thing that someone could do to someone.
Even months after the Caldwells' visit, kids like Emily Eshelman are still this affected.
You feel bad for them that they had to go through that?
A ton.
A ton.
Which is why each fifth grader wrote a letter to Mount Airy. One said, "The Caldwells made me think about not only standing up for myself, but standing up for others and fixing mistakes that were made in the world." In closing, the kids requested an all-expense-paid honeymoon redo, which they got.
It makes me feel really good inside because we know that even though we're just kids, we made an impact on the world.
It was really magnificent to know that kids cared that much. Oh, the rug feels so nice.
I should mention that the original Mount Airy was torn down years ago.
What a beautiful place.
This is a new building with new owners who were just so impressed with the kids, they wanted to help make it right.
Maybe was this worth waiting 60 years for?
Obviously, this does not make up for decades of racial injustice, but it's a step and a sign that we can get there. Steve Hartman, on the road, in the Poconos.
Sometimes there's a lot we can learn from kids, isn't that right? They said, obviously, this does not make up for decades of racial injustice, but it's a step and a sign that we can get there. And friends, I think we can get there, and I think that Christians, people who believe in God, should be leading the way because we have a reason to believe this. We believe that God created the world, that God created each human being in his image, that every human being, regardless of race or ethnicity, every human being is made in the image of God and is worthy of dignity and respect and love. We believe that. And because we believe that, we should be leading the way. I love that one of the kids wrote that meeting the Caldwells made me think about not only standing up for myself, but standing up for others and fixing mistakes that were made in the world. We ought to be doing that. So tomorrow at 10 a.m., I'll be down at the Spokane Convention Center at the Martin Luther King rally, where I'll be celebrating with my brothers and sisters of color the progress we've made, and then marching with them for the progress yet to be made. We can get there. We can get there. And I'm proposing that we ought to be leading the way. So if you're free tomorrow morning at 10, come hang out with me. I'd love to see you there. Let's pray. The psalmist wrote that the heavens declare the glories of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. And a little later, that same psalmist wrote, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you should care? For you have made him a little lower than the angels." Lord, we see in the universe around us your fingerprints. And we see in our own souls those same fingerprints. Thank you. Thank you for leaving enough clues that we can find you and follow you. And in that, Lord, we find our meaning and we understand how you wired us and want us to live. Now help us, Lord. Help us live consistent with those conclusions, Lord. Help us live our lives in such a way that we show a watching world that there's a God who created, a God who redeemed, a God who loves. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everybody.